Good morning, everybody. So nice to see many of our payment friends from the last 2 decades. I have a real pleasure to introduce this panel on open banking and paving the open way to open finance. It's all very open this morning. With me, I've got David Head, Vice President for Open Banking Product Management at Mastercard. To his left, we've got Francesco Simoneschi, co-founder and CEO of TrueLayer, one of the key sponsors of the conference. Then we've got my old friend Basak Toprak from EMEA, Head of eCommerce Solutions at JP Morgan. And Srini Kasturi, another old friend of mine, Global Head of Instant Payments, Country Products and Innovation at Barclays. And this morning we really want to talk about open banking as we have experienced it so far, the lessons learned, an outlook into what's happening beyond the UK and Europe, but also how we are slowly moving to open finance and what that really means, and exploring the perspectives of the different organizations we have on this panel, which are all really quite global, and therefore have had actually some experience in different versions of open banking and potentially also open finance. So I'd like to kind of just kick it off by everybody sort of giving a little bit of an introductory perspective on your views and your organization's views, and then we'll start with questions. So we start with David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Lovely to be here. So open banking from a Mastercard perspective is definitely something that we're hugely committed to and very excited about. As you say, we're taking it from a global perspective, so we are looking at open banking both in Europe, but the US, and around the world. I think we're still at the early stages of it, but I think we're also seeing kind of some real lessons come through in terms of what makes open banking successful, what you need to lay down to get a successful ecosystem, and it is an ecosystem kind of setup, and thoughts on kind of how it's going to evolve. So yeah, it's very exciting for us.
Excellent, and we shall go into some of these examples in a minute. Now, Francesco, TrueLayer is obviously one of the pioneers of open banking, playing a critical role as a third-party provider within the European legislative context, but beyond that. How do you see open banking and open finance really evolving from your business perspective?
Sure, so I think you say rightly, like we were very early into this open banking revolution. Like we were the first TPP in 2018 to get license as to be able to access both data and payments. We were among the first to really make the first payment against banks, and now we are once again the first to connect to a bank and do a VRP transaction, right? So how I see that, like for me, it's the same kind of platform, and just like we go from a feature set to expand this feature set to expand the number of use cases we can serve. So I think it's critical that we don't get like bogged down in semantics into what is open banking, what is open finance, what is the difference. Like it's very important that we just like look this as an overall progression of a technology that is reaching maturity and that has really the mean to innovate in a number of spaces and bring competition, which I think is a very good thing in payments. And you have like great institution. I'm surrounded by great institution that made the history of payments. I believe that open banking has certainly all the ingredients to revolutionize what is a modern payment channel look like from a user experience perspective, what kind of functionality can serve, and what kind of cost and advantages can bring to merchants and consumers.
Great. Now, Basak, from JP Morgan's perspective, this really presents an alternative way of making payments in the e-commerce space. And apart from UK, Europe, I'd just like to hear your sort of general perspective on how it's evolving and what things you've seen work well in the open banking space.
Sure, yeah. From a JP Morgan perspective, open banking is one of the solutions in our toolbox, and we really focus on with our global clients, how can we use open banking to address some of the endemic issues with traditional payment methods. So that's where we're coming at it. How can we solve some of the problems with direct debits, for example, where we can reduce the amount of returns. Open banking is a great niche solution that can help with those specific use cases. Of course, like David said, our clients are also looking at us for global solutions, and I think UK, Europe, we are fairly familiar with the progress, but similarly, if we look east, Hong Kong has its open banking API framework that's in place, progressing through different phases. Australia is a great example, coming at it from a consumer data rights framework perspective, bringing together use cases around collecting consumer data across multiple channels, and then moving towards how to action on those on that information. So great examples there, and I think we're seeing US and Canada making progress as well from a consumer finance promotion and protection perspective. And I think obviously all markets are following each other in terms of the practice, best practices, framework, and coming at it from different perspectives in terms of either regulatory driven or market driven. So it's quite exciting space to watch.
Great, and you rightly say some markets were very much driven by regulation. You needed it to kick it off, whilst other markets have been potentially watching what we were doing in Europe and saying, actually, we might not need only regulation, or maybe not at all, but we can do it with different commercial incentives, and I think that's something we will pick up in a minute. Srini, from Barclays' perspective, is open banking what you thought it would be, and how do we get to where we should be? That sounds quite cool.
Firstly, the fireside chat that just preceded us, it kind of paved the way for this discussion, because a lot of topics that were touched upon there are the fundamental objectives of open banking, which is financial access, well, digital access or financial access. There's hyper-personalization, and some of those benefits are coming out in bits and pieces in some of the innovation canvas that we have in front of us at the present moment, surely gathering steam and becoming bigger. From a payments perspective, really, we're seeing the empowerment of merchants to accept bank payments through open banking. That's one of the first use cases that has really gathered momentum. In general, I think we see open banking as part of a journey, as has already been stated. A good colleague from TrueLayer. It's part of a journey, and it holds a lot of promise. It's very consumer and client-centric, and that's where the real value is, because it refocuses a lot of investment wallet into doing what is really valuable as client experiences in terms of opening up control of their data to them, to be able to do things that they want to do with their data, to be able to make payments they want to do the way they want to do it, and all leading to the hyper-personalized end state, which is a bit of a dream at the moment.
Yes, that's really helpful. And I think maybe to summarize, the key theme of open banking, open finance in the underlying nature is, of course, data. And many of you have referred to it. And I'm wondering whether for data to work well throughout the economy, we do need actually regulatory regimes. I mean, we have GDPR in Europe, we have GDPR-like legislation emerging in other countries, but I would probably think it's a precondition to have the right security around data, the right privacy, so that every user feels comfortable using it beyond payments, which is, of course, the business promise here, right? Now, David, in terms of Mastercard's perspective, sort of balancing the incentives around the commercial side versus the regulatory, do we always need a hammer? How do you see this as Mastercard, and are you influencing that debate as well in practice?
Yeah, I think it's undoubtedly regulation has acted as a stimulus in certain markets, in Europe particularly, to get open banking going, and I think that's been powerful. I think however, from a Mastercard perspective, is not all markets have been regulated. So if you look in the US, for example, that wasn't a regulated market, and they've evolved differently. Their data models are different. They've got wider access to data at the moment, and therefore the use cases they're bringing forward are more compelling. If you think of people like Robinhood with their wealth management, the work that Finicity is doing around lending, their lending algorithms are richer because they get access to a richer data set. So I think there is a degree of, clearly, regulation can act as a stimulus, but I think it's getting the balance there in terms of then commercializing it. If I look across Europe, what we see is that markets where it's just almost been adoption of the regulation is literally, there's not the same levels of engagement and commitment to it. and therefore the standards are difficult, and the use cases that get generated are poorer as a result of it. Where you've got people working together in a collaborative manner, and the UK market with the open banking implementation entity is quite a good example from that, consolidating around standards, user experiences, a more commercial-minded kind of model. That's when I think you can see that you get better experiences. And therefore, from a Mastercard perspective, we're absolutely committed to the principles of open finance, the need. I think you made a brilliant point about the data being secure. That's an absolute given and minimum. But on top of that, I think it's then using commercial and cooperation, the players working together to develop stronger propositions and resolve the inevitable issues that two parties trying to get, exchange data securely, efficiently, and correctly would come across.
And I think building on the sort of regulatory and also scheme standard-related straitjacket sometimes. I think, Francesco, when we talked about this before, you made a really good point around the ability to move faster, because the challenge has always been, and of course many of us lived through the SEPA example, which took 10 years and more. It took forever to agree on something, and then it took forever to implement it. And I think we are now in a world where things move so fast, we need to be able to be faster. So I would like to hear your views both generically and also in relation to VRP, variable recurring payments, one of those payment acronyms, just as an example maybe, yeah.
Absolutely. So I think we said at the very beginning, like, it is about competition. And so it's competition not just among different payment methods, but like also within payment institution and banks mainly, right? And so I think what we saw with open banking is that the industry can really develop at the speed of the fastest, like whatever provides the best experience to their own customer, then they make more transactions, they create more loyalty among their customer base, and it's no secret that when I look at the numbers of open banking transactions, like I see, for instance, Monzo and Revolut, like clearly like outstanding in terms of like experience over maybe other banks that still they've done a good job, but not at that kind of level of execution. So what you have compared to other payment methods is this ability of the banks to dramatically compete also when it comes to the user experience of payments. And I think like further down the line, that will create an opportunity for banks to leverage this way of interacting with end consumers and use open banking as a channel to deliver additional services or functionalities, or just like create deeper relation with their own customers, right? And VRP is a good example where at this point in time you have let's call it like open banking implementation entity and governance of open banking that is trying to develop a VRP standard. VRP is the acronym of variable recurring payment, which means like an open mandate, a little bit like direct debit, to your bank account, so that a merchant or another financial application can kind of like swift a variable sum of money over a period of time, right? So similar to direct debit or a credit card on file, just like in the open banking context. And what we see right now is a lot of like political battling over what is the definition of this VRP, but at the same time, like banks are in the market now creating bilateral relationship with companies like ourselves to deliver something that will, in time, enable consumers to have a better experience. That, to me, is an example of you have a competitive market, you have banks that recognizes the importance of delivering more value to their own consumers and customers, and then you have the market kind of structuring in a way that can fill this source of gap in terms of like functionalities that are not yet fully realized by a nation technology. And I believe that that's how like the market should operate. Like you should have initial incentives maybe drawn by a regulator, but then the regulator needs to be savvy enough to open up a level of competition and make sure that this sort of organization of the market, this market structure can still happen and competition be delivered, and the best companies and the best product can succeed.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's about having the right principles in law, such as data security, privacy, the ability to access on a fair competitive level, but then let the market develop. And I think that's really critical when we think about open finance, because that's all about data. So we would need to make sure that we don't necessarily curtail the market to develop there. And maybe just one comment to throw in, which is really relevant for the banks, of course, is that solutions such as TrueLayer with AIS make it so much easier to get a lot of data of your potential client, your existing client, and particularly in the SME and business space, because that sort of data, you then have an ecosystem developing around analytics. You have the ability to understand your client before you even onboarded the client properly, and that makes it so much easier then for providers, whether it's payment providers, FX providers, or banks in general, to actually think about which solutions would fit that client, so that for your first client meeting, you're actually coming in with the right ideas because you know how the client operates today. But my question to both JP Morgan and Barclays would be at this stage, how have you seen corporate client demand in this space, and how did it vary across the different geographies, some more regulatory driven, some more business incentive driven, and is there sort of a mechanism for corporates to engage a bit more in this debate to co-create solutions? So how you collaborate with third parties and other providers to satisfy your corporate needs. Basak, give us some examples.
I'll give 2 examples, and one of them I mentioned before around direct debits space. One of our clients, a global online streaming company, had issues around direct debit returns. I mean, percentage-wise, is not a lot, 2-3%, but for their volumes, it's huge. So we worked with them, co-created this solution with them to use open banking for the first payment before a direct debit mandate is generated, right? So that was a really kind of niche use case which worked really well. Other clients, marketplaces are hugely interested in open banking space to see how that can be an alternative method of payment without giving up on the customer journey, right? To not create more steps, more screens versus a credit card payment. And that's a key one. And as Francesco mentioned, for payment nerds here, VRP has been a great evolution. I mean, if you think about it, recurring payment space hasn't been innovated for a very long time. So, this is something we're really excited about. And yes, I agree. I think, it's probably slow and there will be restrictions around it to start with. But it's definitely a very exciting space. And in terms of markets, really, our clients, big marketplaces are looking at UK as a starting point, and then they expect that other countries will follow in terms of implementing VRP-like solutions in the future.
Mm-hmm. And Srini, do you have some examples of how your clients have been knocking on your door for open banking?
So we have a wide range, a spectrum of client segments. And within corporate banking, there's so many industries. So obviously, the use cases per industry vary. And it's quite intuitive to say that segments that are in the B2C space show a deeper interest, specifically within the e-commerce space. So that's one side of it. Then we also serve a number of fintechs and power their experiences. So we have a number of active conversations ongoing with fintechs on how they can better use open banking, and there's a huge amount of demand there. Because what is special about fintechs is that they're very focused and in solving a monoline problem, and they're able to address subscale segments that don't necessarily make sense for a universal bank to assign resources to. So we see that as a path to serving our customers better by serving our fintechs and enabling new payment experiences coming out of these fintechs. And the last piece is obviously the merchant side of things, because Barclays Card Payments is a huge presence in the acquiring space. And we've switched on the capability to initiate or for merchants to start accepting bank payments through open banking rails. So that's kind of the spectrum, and I would say B2C with digital presence through to fintechs and merchants. So there is a lot of traction, definitely.
And maybe coming back to Mastercard, you've obviously been investing globally around many markets and have lessons learned in terms of open banking. How do you feel about anything that you've seen that worked well in other markets that could help accelerate open finance in the UK and Europe?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things about, we talked about payments, we talked about data. And I think when you look at open banking data compared to payments, data is more difficult.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to understand what the data is, make sure it flows correctly, you store it. And I think the lessons from one of our companies that we've recently acquired, Aya, is about the quality and the quality of the data, and then working with both sides of the ecosystem to make that data work for them. And I think as we move into open finance, those sources of data aren't just going to be bank accounts. They're going to be investment companies. They're going to be mortgage companies. You're pulling lots of different data sources together, and those systems aren't necessarily as robust as the underlying internet banking, mobile banking systems that we're using with open banking today. And therefore, I think one of the lessons that we're going to need to work together is on standards and quality, understanding what use cases that customers are really trying to prove, matching those up, and then pulling the exact data that they need without trying to be too general in trying to solve everything in one go. I think it's that selectivity around use cases, getting the quality of the data right, and working with people to pull the right data through is going to be vital.
Yeah. And you mentioned the data models differ across the market, which is, of course, one of the challenges.
Between the markets, between the banks, the way they provide it. Yeah, the role, therefore, of as much as you can get standardization and people operating to standards will make life easier. It's never going to be perfect. Even in markets like the UK, where there's a very tight standard, there is still, every bank has their nuances in terms of the way they serve the data. And therefore, understanding those nuances and helping your clients solve for them so that they can deliver a simple experience for the customer is absolutely vital to what we're trying to achieve.
But it feels to me that open finance piece, which is this data-based one, is therefore a much bigger challenge, because in a way we would need to find some common denominator on the most useful business cases, the most useful customer experiences that commercially deliver for everybody somehow, in order to make the effort as an ecosystem to work on those standards, right?
Yes.
So that sounds a bit of a tricky one to solve. Who would like to comment on that, or how you think we could engage on this? Because clearly everybody has a slightly different perspective, and the client should be in the middle. But how do you get there?
It is a tricky. Sorry.
No, go ahead. It is a tricky question.
All right. Yeah, it is tricky, and there isn't a clean answer for it, except that the whole point of having an innovation ecosystem born out of open banking is to be able to be more agile and flexible around the traditional blobs of data, and there, I think we've come a long way in that there is already some structure defined, and that structure is available. It has a few nuances, okay, but those nuances aren't the traditional blobs that we've had to struggle with in the past. So we're already in a bit better place. I think what's really important about data leading to open finance is the regulation around the use of that data, the protection, the consumer protection that comes with it, the consumer feeling in control of their data. That's really important. And from a regulatory perspective, that's the most important objective to drive that will benefit the uptake of these solutions amongst consumers. It gives confidence. So that's really key. The standardization, I think that's something for us to worry about. Behind the scenes, it's something for us to solve for. And of course, it's an area of competition as well. Firms that deal with that, those variations better are going to succeed. So that is also fine, actually.
And Basak, maybe just looking at your experience in the different markets, did you feel that there was some sort of real lessons learned that we could apply in Europe or the UK that markets did better?
Yeah, I think in line with what Srini said as well. I think we obviously standards are helpful, right? And when it comes to data, we will need more frameworks around it. Data is good, but it depends also how it's used, right? We may find that certain products that could be open and available to certain sets of people today may not be available in the future, right? So how that works in terms of how the guidelines are established, frameworks are established, is important. I think overall, there is no question, open finance and then leading to open data will help. There is a McKinsey study which predicts that in the US, UK, and Europe, once open data ecosystems are established and fully functioning, it will boost GDP up to 1.5%. So these are not just interesting facts, but actually these are hugely important figures. So I think we'll get there, but there will be a journey in terms of how it's implemented globally.
And I think the challenge is we're no longer in a community where it's just the banks, for example. We have banks, we have third-party providers, we have different fintechs enabling analytics and connectivity. We have big players such as Mastercard, they're regulators. So everybody has to sort of work together, which is going to be interesting to see how we could maybe experiment with this in the UK to start off with.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right, and it's finding the use case, it's finding the problem areas, where is there friction that everybody agrees on, and then everyone is motivated to find an answer. And if you can get sort of some of that together, or you incentivize other elements that you need, I think that's going to be the crucial way with the data, is to find those magic use cases. And what we're seeing with, pulling the analogy from what we're seeing with open banking today, is where it really works well is where you've got some of our payment use cases that we're seeing, where customers have got a much slicker experience. It's easier for them. They're not queuing things in. So they're just doing. They don't know they're doing open banking. They're just using an easier way of working. Mm. But then our clients, people consuming it, what they're discovering from it is not only is the customer's happier and doing more because they're using it, but there's other benefits as well. They're taking out the costs. There's less errors. There's less mistakes. And it's therefore building up that side of the equation. Then you've got a sort of a rounded business case of why you want to do this and why you want to invest. And I think you play the same kind of thinking into the world of data as well, and find those exact same use cases that everyone will benefit from, because it's taking out friction from not just the consumer, but the provider of the data. Exactly. and the individuals looking to benefit from it.
It's the automation. I mean, that's what I love about PIS, but equally AIS provides so much potential on the data you can see. Francesco, what's your perspective on this, and how you sort of think of engaging maybe in the UK to find such a community ecosystem use case, but also what's your strategy around the rest of the world at this point?
So, first, let me just comment a little bit on this sort of like world that is very much divided between data and payments, like almost like being completely different quantities. Like, the reality is that this is a quirk of the way, especially regulators, like they defined in the UK and Europe, like those two segments, right? Going back, like I see those as features of a single platform that can do many things, and then I think like different businesses are just gonna select certain feature for certain use cases. We at TrueLayer, we are tremendously focused to solve the way basically consumers can transact with the digital business, and so mainly onboarding, payments, reconciliation of payments, refunds, and like the whole like package of like how do you get to value, and you shrink time to value for consumers, right? And you enable convenience. Now, this is happening, to answer your question, like clearly at different speed in different countries, for the reason that certain countries are regulatory led, so all the banks and TPPs are moving and creating an ecosystem because a regulator kind of instigated that sort of movement. Some others are more commercially led, and to be frank, like this commercial push, it is coming because a lot of companies, they have been doing things like screen scraping for many, many years and creating problems for banks, and that's where also it makes sense to come to a commercial deal, a commercial agreement to say, how do we go and protect consumers from like using screen scraping, which technologically speaking, it's not like the best thing you can do, right? And so today, like there are clearly pockets of different, different countries, different regions, like reacting in different ways. So you have UK, fairly advanced, very regulatory driven. I think like we have a very smart and well implemented kind of industry ecosystem that resembles around the OBIE. There is a lot of discussion over like the future governance of this industry body, but I think like on balance, like there's been tremendous momentum in this space. Rest of Europe is way more fragmented. You got like the Nordics, where they have a culture of like account-to-account payments, and companies that are very well established. You have, I don't know, a country like also the Netherlands, where you have Ideal, which has been some sort of like pioneer to open banking as a bank-led scheme, like alternative to other payment methods. And then you have countries like maybe France that resembles the UK, where like it's very like card heavy, and open banking is following like exactly the same trajectory, right? And so the major innovation in those markets are going to be around the user experience. Like, can we bring some components that we pioneered here in the UK, such as, for instance, app-to-app and using biometrics to authenticate a payment, into all those different markets? And what we see is very good momentum in Spain, very good momentum in France, very good momentum in Germany, absolutely the Nordics. Unfortunately, Italy is a little bit like behind them Italians, so like there is an element of national pride that unfortunately is holding me back. And then if you zoom out in the world, like I think there are two countries that are now certainly on the map for TrueLayer, but I'm sure for many others. Like one is Australia, where we do have a team, but more broadly, I believe like there is another ecosystem that is flourishing around a regulatory-led initiative. Right now is very much, again, like organized around data-enabled use cases, but this is quickly becoming also a payment-enabled use case, and those two things, like, they're going to merge, and I think a few years from now, you're not going to see the difference of like those two use cases as completely separate. And the other one is Brazil. It's a massive economy. I think there is a very different level of penetration of more traditional payment methods, and also very different level of overall, like, financial inclusion. And so innovation there is taking like a different flavor through wallets, through the likes of like new banks and so to speak. And open banking is creating yet another opportunity to onboard like literally like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of consumers into digital propositions, whether are financial services or e-commerce, and create an entire like new infrastructure where those digital activities can happen. I'm extremely excited about those two new markets, and certainly like I think the US is a level of maturity when it comes to have a story that is more commercial led, and it's also massive. Like if you look at the numbers, what companies like Plaid and Finicity they have done in the last few years, like are massive numbers. And so I believe that we still treat open banking and account-to-account like as this sort of like up and upcoming thing. The reality is that it's already here, it's been working for years, and will continue to just like grow and grow and grow, and that's here to stay. Sorry for.
Yeah.
If I may just differ a little bit, just for the fun of it, right?
Yes.
That data and payments are pretty much the same thing, or end up being the same thing. I think that is true in an open banking framework. But the moment we go open finance, I think data becomes vastly more important, because payment is a single use case of all of that data. Insurance, investments, credit, pensions. When all of that comes into play, then it's not really about the payments alone. It's about optimizing the financial wallet of an individual, hyper-personalizing it for them. So I think, just going forward, I think data is going to be way more important than payments.
Yeah. I mean, my question was building upon the background that we have in Europe, particularly around the regulated space, very specific on the payment API. lots of discussions has been happening for years around premium APIs with different use cases, which of course are not mandated by law, but should be a commercial opportunity. Now, in the network industry, we know it only works if enough people are actually offering it, right? Because otherwise it doesn't flow from A to B. This is clearly an area where maybe we can learn from the US and some of the more commercial markets to see what were the successful use cases there that we could bring into an extended API ecosystem in Europe and UK. And one of the examples, of course, coming back to financial inclusion, which is a really important point that also does apply to our market, is of course elements such as digital identity. Is there something where we can include a premium API data set where the banks provide data based on customer consent to allow to authenticate, to allow to onboard, much more frictionless than filling in all these forms online and making 10,000 mistakes? But maybe just to reflect on this I guess commercial use case and how we can get some consensus on this.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it is things like digital identity. I think we're already seeing some of that using open banking data today in that to smooth the account opening online. But I think you're spot on in terms of in markets in the US. I think we've seen a lot of that. We're making better lending decisions based on fullest access to the data. Yeah. Now, the US has historically come from, as Francesco said, a sort of screen scraping background to that, but increasingly now they're working on premium API, an API-based model, and to encourage that API model, then that's where you're striking commercial agreements, and you're starting to see those agreements come in. So there is something, you are incentivized to provide secure access, fast access to high-quality data, and you're getting something back from doing so, and that's then giving the ecosystem chance to develop those use cases that actually do make those difference and make the lending, widen that lending net to those that need it.
Yeah. Francesca, I did mention that based on the existing AIS as an example, you can already have a lot of data based on customer consent, whether it's accountancy packages or bank account data. So there is opportunity if you're commercially minded as an institution using open banking to obtain the data with consent, to analyze it properly, and to therefore design your solutions for the client, which are far beyond payments, of course, Srini. And I don't yet see enough people doing it. And equally, I completely hear the need for commercial ability to go far beyond the regulatory, which is very much what you're saying, Francesco, right?
Yeah, and by the way, I don't disagree. Like, I believe the data has
having some fun.
Gigantic port. I'm just like, my point is more around like payments. It is at this point in time, at the very least, like the vector of growth for adoption of this sort of fundamental set of primitives that open banking provides, and then you can make those payments very smart by coupling on top the data and make sure that there is a level of personalization or competition among different services, and that's absolutely right. So if we have to zoom in on, for instance, AAS and use cases that we find right now in the market, like I would say there is a certain level of, the market started out of account aggregation, which means like I bring all the different data of different bank accounts under a single umbrella. And I think like we do have a number of successful proposition in the market. And I think like this is a feature that over time will become some sort of like hygiene feature level for several like banks, whether are traditional or new banks. And we, for instance, empower Revolut to do that, and they do that fairly successfully. Then we figured as an industry that this data had value beyond just account aggregation into several other use cases. Like one notable one is around like making credit and lending decisions. So whether I'm an SMB, and I think during COVID, like this was even more important, right? Where you had this sort of shock in the economy and you had to make decisions based on the last couple of weeks of operations. But also for consumers, it's the same. Like you want to have that sort of like precise analytical view of what, like how much money is coming in, how much money is coming out. There's any like reason, red flags for not extending like a line of credit to this consumer. And this is something that banks have been done for a very long time. The problem is like this data now is flowing digitally. So that means that one, can be crunched in a digital fashion, and two, the user can just share it forward with just like click of a button or just with Face ID, which in itself, I believe it's pretty nice and innovative. And along the same line, we figured that, okay, this data may really have an impact on onboarding into, at the very least, financial services and the broader extent of like marketplaces and completing any sorts of transactions. So we do have customers that, for instance, are using AIS to validate bank accounts in real time. I'm the answering question like, who's the legitimate owner of a bank account? Can I reduce frauds and risk for transacting with like an unknown prospective customer? Can I validate source of funds? Can I somehow like de-risk that transaction? And we see several different variation of this use case happening into the market right now. There's one gigantic that I think like is a little bit overlooked, which is Nectar. Like we have been doing like a partnership with Nectar now for the past few years, and they're now growing tremendously. And they are using AIS to basically do attribution of points and rewards to their own consumers very successfully. This is probably like maybe a little bit different than everything that we saw in the market, but this is a major UK brand that is adopting open banking for like vast majority of their customer base very successfully.
Excellent. Well, this light keeps on flashing, so I'm getting a bit nervous.
Yes,
and David is here, and I'm getting even more nervous.
I'm protecting your coffee breaks.
So can I just say a great thanks, I guess in a very nutshell summary, client-centric, using data, cutting costs, becoming compliant and efficient, but actually creating more commercial value with incentives we can see from around the world. Good luck to all of you. I hope you enjoyed the panel.
Ruth, thank you very much as well for chairing.